I am tired of hearing how terrible it is to write purple prose. As a person who adores vivid, atmospheric, literary, flowery, ornate writing, both as a reader and an author, I'm now going to subject you to however many minutes this is going to last of why I think we need to destigmatize purple prose. Before I get into it, just a reminder, my second novel is Song at Dead Man's Cove, which is a gothic horror novel with siren mythology, attachment psychology, and all that good stuff, is releasing this June, so make sure you subscribe to my email newsletter at drannayuden.com so that you can be alerted once it's out. Without further ado, let me rant about the war on purple prose. So let me give a brief history of what was considered good writing stylistically over the course of time. In the ancient classical period, so around 500 BC to about 500 AD, rhythmic, ornate prose was the standard in order to sort of persuade audiences. You had certain philosophers like Cicero and Plato whose mission that was. And they had very long sentences with grand rhetorical flourishes. Then in the medieval era, so around 500 to 1400s, there was a shift to more clerical writing, more plain, sermonic, just meant to teach a Christian lesson, really spoke to austere Christian attitudes of the time. Then during the Renaissance era, which was the 1400s to 1700s, it flipped back to a more literary, poetic style. Good writing was considered writing filled with metaphors that was more elaborate. It was highly decorative. Then in the Enlightenment, so 1700 to around 1800, with the uprise of people like Voltaire, history decided, no, actually, we're back to more clear and concise language. Language is a tool meant for rationality and plain empiricism, and emotional expressive language should be discouraged. Then in the Victorian era, from around 1830 to 1900, there were authors that rose to fame like Edgar Allan Poe or Charlotte Bronte, and purple prose was again acceptable, and there were a lot of lush descriptions and very poetic emotional prose. And now modern times, from the 20th century onwards, I think it's more experimental, it's more varied. You see some purple prose in the bestsellers list, and you also see some very bare bones prose in the bestsellers list. And although many flowery writing authors do very well on the book market, there's this undercurrent of opinion that purple prose equals bad, beige prose equals good. And I believe that this comes from the pendulum swing of history, because in the Victorian era, purple prose was the norm, and now we're switching back to, no, we need to write more austere. All of history is just an overcorrection. But if we look at even just the definitions of beige prose versus purple prose, we can hear how there's so much more of a bias in how purple prose is bad. So beige prose is a writing style defined by simple words, short sentences, and minimal description, whereas purple prose is defined as the excessive use of adjectives, adverbs, and metaphors. And I recently found out why this is. It actually comes from the term purple prose. The Roman poet, I don't know how to pronounce this, Horace, back in the day, compared excessively flowery language to the purple patches that people would sometimes sew on their clothes in an attempt to look fancier or more colorful than they had the means for. So in that sense, purple prose is by definition something that's trying to be fancier than it is, something that's kind of putting on a facade, but is actually not that well written. So I should clarify that, actually in this video, what I'm talking about is flowery language, which is not by definition excessively done. And I guess technically purple prose is by definition poorly done flowery language. But I have to say, if purple prose inherently has negative valence, I think the term beige prose should too. It seems only fair. Because too many people these days assume that anything with embellishments, even if it's really masterfully done, is automatically exaggerated purple prose. And I just don't think that's true. So as an act of defiance towards those people, I'm going to be referring to purple prose in this video as neutral. So my opinion is that there's no right or wrong style. Trends and conventions come and go. The pendulum swings from one side to the other. But at the end of the day, different readers like different things, and there is a market for every style. Not liking purple prose is just a personal preference, and it drives me up a fucking wall when people act like there is anything objective about which is better or worse. I don't like beige prose. I don't like it. I don't think it's good. But I recognize that's my personal subjectivity. So I'm not going to say that somebody is necessarily a bad writer just because they write in a style that's not for me. I think both styles can be done poorly or they can be done well. So what does purple prose look like when it's done poorly? When it's done poorly, it's kind of redundant, where it's clear that the author is just kind of looking for filler words. They might say things like, the winding road curled like a snake. You don't have to say it's winding and curled and like a snake. They all kind of say the same thing. So maybe a better way to say it would be, the road wound like a snake. Or sometimes authors will try to think of a fancy word, or they're overusing a thesaurus to the point where it becomes clear that the author doesn't even know what the word means. Like sometimes people will say they decimated this people, to say like they completely wiped out this people, when really decimated means that 1 in 10 people were lost. So maybe they should have said obliterate instead. When it's done poorly, purple prose also just tries to do too much at once. It's kind of overwhelming the senses to the point where the reader can't even visualize what's going on. So for example, an excerpt might be, she walked past the burgundy coffee table to the kitchen island where Josie stood peeling an orange and wearing a coy little smile, her eyes dancing cerulean like the sky above a dazzling ocean. If I were to improve this to kind of preserve some of the aesthetic aspects of it without overwhelming the reader so much, I might instead say, she walked to the kitchen island where Josie stood peeling an orange. Josie wore a coy little smile, her eyes dancing with a cerulean twinkle. I cut out the first sentence about the burgundy coffee table because it's just not relevant. And it's enough to say that her eyes have a cerulean twinkle. You don't also need to compare it to a dazzling ocean. They both kind of say the same thing. Also, with poorly done purple prose, every single sentence is ornate rather than having some diversity in the sentence structure. So here's how you might do that, how you might make something flowery while also switching up the structure. He was a tall fellow with a hawkish nose and eyes the color of pebbles. His eyes, they bore into me. It reminded me of the way a predator sinks his teeth into the flesh of his prey. Callously, assuredly. I did not know what to say. You switch up sentence length. Some are longer, some are shorter. Some contain metaphors, some don't. Some contain adjectives, some don't. And then you end with, I did not know what to say, which is just kind of, bare bones. It's direct, it's simple. With bad purple prose, the reader is also just left not understanding what the fuck they just read. So for example, one book that I think does this, unfortunately, is The Salt Grows Heavy by Cassandra Caw. One sentence that I picked out was, theirs is the only feather amidst the despoiled charcuterie, the mold-spotted bread. I have no idea what she was talking about in this scene. And in fact, I had no idea what the entire book was about, because I got the sense that this was just a book meant to impress us with how many words the author knows, rather than actually helping the reader engage with the contents at all. This also happens in nonfiction. So recently I read the book Anti-Fragile, and there's this one sentence. So for now we are looking at the forward arrow, and at no point, although science was at some use along the way since computer technology relies on science in most of its aspects, at no point did academic science serve in setting its direction. Rather, it served as a slave to chance discoveries in an opaque environment, with almost no one but college dropouts and overgrown high school students along the way. What are these sentences trying to say? Well, I guess it's all one sentence. So what is this one sentence trying to say? Why can't you chop it up into digestible sentences that the reader can actually understand the contents of what you're saying, particularly in nonfiction, right? I think sometimes academics can write like this, can come off just very pompous, where it's okay to use words that, a person might need to look up now and then, but they should still be able to understand what the fuck you're saying. Versus, let me give you an example of really beautiful purple prose. This is from I Am by Maggie O'Farrell. What happened to that girl and what so nearly happened to me is not something to be lightly articulated, molded into anecdote, formed into a familiar spoken groove to be told and retold over a dinner table or on the telephone, passed from teller to teller. It is instead a tale of horror, of evil, of our worst imaginings. It is a story to be kept battened down in some wordless, unvisited dark place. Death brushed past me on that path, so close that I could feel its touch, but it seized that other girl and thrust her under. It's really easy to visualize. Each word is really picked carefully so that you can see it coming to life in your mind's eye. You can almost see the anecdote being passed down from person to person. It has a very lyrical, poetic rhythm. It has a powerful metaphor, and you can just tell that the author is well aware of what each word means, that she has masterfully selected each one, rather than just haphazardly picking whatever sounds the most bombastic. So then on the other hand, what does beige prose look like when it's done poorly? I think it leaves too much to the imagination, to the point where I have no idea where the story even takes place, what the characters look like, what their surroundings are like, nothing but a vague glimmer here and there. For example, take this excerpt from the book We Used to Live Here. There's someone in the basement. Charlie blinked. The kid? No, an adult. Charlie rubbed her eyes and pushed up to sit. One of the parents? No. In the basement? Eve nodded. On the stairs. Charlie frowned. So we know that the characters are blinking, nodding, frowning, but how does that actually look? I don't just want a description of what actions they're taking. I want to know what makes the way that they're doing these things unique, what it reveals about the characters, or at the very least to be transported there in the room with them. I want it to be shown to me rather than just be told in simple verbs. So here's how I would tweak it, personally. There's someone in the basement. Charlie batted her lashes. The kid? No, an adult. Charlie rubbed the crust from her eyes and pushed off the coverlets. One of the parents? No. In the basement? Eve nodded. On the stairs. Charlie's mouth quirked down. Now, I could have added more about the tone, the way that they spoke these lines of dialogue, but I wanted to just keep it very similar in structure to what the author originally did. So instead of just very bare bones describing blinking, batted her lashes is more visual. We get more of a representation in our heads of what it actually looks like to blink, instead of just rubbing her eyes and pushing up to sit. Rubbing the crust from her eyes is more vivid. Pushing off the coverlets gives you the chance to kind of visualize, oh yeah, she's sitting on coverlets. What might those look like? Instead of just Charlie frowned, okay, how does it look when she's frowning? Show me rather than telling me. That's why I changed it to her mouth quirked down. Also, I think when it's done poorly, beige prose tends to be pretty emotionally stunted. It doesn't seem to capture the emotional undercurrents between characters and certainly doesn't manage to get the reader to feel anything. For example, it might say, "I don't love you anymore," she said, turning away. He just stood there. If I were to improve this to make it more emotional, I might say, "I don't love you anymore," she said, her voice no louder than a whisper. She turned her back to him so that he could not see the tears budding in her eyes. He stood there, arms hanging flaccidly from his sides for a long time. Versus there are times when beige prose is done really well. For instance, I think The Last House on Needless Street, for some of the chapters, is pretty bare bones. Others are a little bit more descriptive. But for example, one of the POVs is from the perspective of a cat. A cat wouldn't be overly flowery in its descriptions, but somehow the word choices that the author uses still manage to evoke emotional meaning and to show the character's internality, to get us to notice what the character would notice in the environment. So for example, this chapter is from the character's POV. So the cat's owner's name is Ted, and the cat is talking about Ted's child. Small Teds are awful. You never know what they're going to do. And Lauren has some kind of psychological issue. I'm not clear on the details, but it seems to involve being very rude and loud. Cats are sensitive to noise. We see with our ears and noses. I mean, with our eyes too, obviously. Lauren has left scrawling, messy doodles all over the whiteboard by the refrigerator. Blah, 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 she has written. Ted is Ted. Olivia's a cat. What great observations. She'll go far. The cat chapters were so funny and so endearing to me, and they had very little description, It could have been done poorly, but it was an example of really well done beige prose. That was my rant. Let me know what you thought about what I said here. What is your stylistic preference when you're reading fiction? Hope this was entertaining to watch me rant for however many minutes, and I'll see you soon.